The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, O Lord.
At that time, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them. And his clothes became radiantly, intensely white, and as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. For he did not know what to say, for they were terrified. And a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And suddenly, looking around, they no longer saw anyone with them, but only Jesus. And as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Mountains are special to many cultures and religions. When we travel by road and we see in the top of the mountain sometimes a little temple or a minaret, a Buddhist stupa, or maybe even a cross or a chapel. Because mountains are seen as places where heaven touches the earth, where God comes to meet humanity. This, therefore, is where revelation happens. Now, in the first reading on Mount Moriah, it seems that there is a rather bloodthirsty looking God demanding the blood of Isaac. Will God just throw away Isaac, who is the child of the promise? Is God playing a cruel joke? Does God thrill in snatching away the ones we love? Are God's promises meant merely to tease us or to test us? What really is the point of this story? Commentators rightly point out that this is a protest against child sacrifice that was very prevalent at that time. But it's interesting to know how this story, this experience ends. Now, child sacrifice was practiced across in Canaan often enough to avert God's anger. But this reading comes to say this should not ever happen in the faith that the God of Israel, that Yahweh, is calling upon his people. This reading is not so much about the sacrifice of Isaac. The Jewish tradition describes it more appropriately. It speaks about the binding of Isaac. It is more than just a sacrifice of the child. It's a sacrifice of all that is dear to oneself that is expressed in a surrender. Abraham teaches us the grace to surrender in a manner in which he surrendered his only son Isaac. Now, in the season of Lent, many people think that they will give up their chocolate or their sweets or their alcohol and drinks. Great. But to what purpose? Like Abraham, are we willing to give up all that comes in our way of relationship with God? Our sinful attitudes and behaviors, other things that are so centered about ourselves that comes in the way of drawing closer to God and closer to one another. And we surrender all these things so that it will be for the praise of God and for the upliftment of others. We become the best version of ourselves as God meant us to be, because that's what the season of Lent calls us to. Now, if in the first reading Mount Moriah was a place of God's revelation, in the book of Genesis, we have this revelation happen in the gospel on this Mount of Transfiguration. Interestingly, we hear words like Mount Tabor or Mount Hermon. These don't appear in the text. Much later tradition attributes one or the other to these places. And as we listen to God, who's now pointing to the Son Jesus, there is a rich background of the Old Testament at play, and God reveals himself in a dramatic way with an all-time big cast of Moses and of Elijah. Because what we see in Moses, on the Mount Sinai, sometimes referred to as Mount Horeb, we have the revelation of God's law, what we call the Ten Commandments. Now, in Matthew's Gospel, he projects Jesus as the new Moses, because when Jesus goes to the Sermon on the Mount, he's giving the law to the people with a major difference. Moses merely transmitted the law from God, but Jesus is giving the law. It was said to you of old, but I say to you. So Jesus is the new Moses, but much more than the old Moses. Moses represents the law. We have Elijah. His name is his vocation, because his name in Hebrew, Eliyahu, says, Yahweh is my God, the Lord is my God. And therefore, Elijah on Mount Carmel, another mountain, is really having an experience of God where he resists, confronts, and defeats the false prophets of Baal. As a prophet, Elijah called them to follow the one true God. So Moses then is the symbol of the law, and Elijah symbolizes the prophets. And the law and the prophets are the backbone of Jewish tradition, as observed by the scribes and the Pharisees. Jewish tradition also required two witnesses, and so these are two witnesses who hear the voice of the Father. Says, this is my beloved Son, listen to him. Don't listen to the scribes and the Pharisees, but listen to Jesus, now attested by the two witnesses representing the law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah. And that is the rich revelation that appears on this mountain. In this we see, in the language Hebrew, Shema means not only to listen, it is to obey. In fact, the word obedience comes from the Latin ob audire. Audire, audience, audio means to listen. And when we really listen to the voice of God, we cannot but obey. And that is why we see the confirmation not only of who Jesus is, but the message he's come to proclaim. Now, on this Mount of Transfiguration, there are three others as well: Peter, James, and John. They are so thrilled with this whole experience that Peter is almost tongue-tied. It's such a marvelous experience, he wants to freeze it forever. Lord, let's build 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. In Jesus, they see a glimpse of his glory, a taste of what the resurrection would be like, a kind of a mini experience. And that's what the transfiguration does. It's such an intimate, but the problem is Peter is trying to freeze this moment for all time. That happens to us. Sometimes we've had such a close experience of God, we keep that as a point of reference, that we are not open to a newer experiences of God that come to us along life's faith and life's journey. Now, the revelation does not stop here. There is more to come in the revelation of the Messiah. The transfiguration, let's situate it in the context of the gospel. Just before this transfiguration event, Jesus is there with his disciples at Caesarea Philippi, and Peter recognizes Jesus as the Messiah. And Jesus acknowledges it. Then, after that, he tells him, but the Son of Man is going to suffer. He predicts his passion, his suffering, and death. Now, this is too much for them to bear. In fact, the idea of the Messiah at that time was someone who would triumphantly overthrow the Roman Empire. The idea that a Messiah would be someone who was rejected, made to suffer, and die at the hands of his own people was simply unthinkable. So this special experience of the transfiguration is given to them to balance out this picture. It seems that these three disciples, including the leader Peter, are given a glimpse of this side of Jesus to help them through the dark days ahead. Back to Peter, James, and John. They will return with Jesus to another mountain when the passion and the countdown to his death begins. The mount is the Mount of Olives and the Garden of Gethsemane, where there is another revelation that's going to take place. Only thing here on the Mount of Olives, it's not going to be transfiguration. It's going to be the disfiguration. They will see the suffering that Jesus is going to endure in his agony in the garden. If they saw the transfigured and the glorious Messiah on this mountain, they're going to see the struggles and the disfigured Messiah on the other mountain, the Mount of Olives, and then Mount Calvary. Now, Peter, James, and John see the transfigured Jesus now, before they see the disfigured Jesus at the Passion. The consolations of God are meant to strengthen us in the time of our desolation. We now turn to the second reading and listen to the wisdom of God spoken through St. Paul. For a number of people, to believe in God means that you guarantee yourself an insurance. Insurance against sickness, against financial problems, against pain, and even against death. And when these things don't happen the way we have planned or prayed for, we rush to another strange God who we think will be able to deliver on my terms, what I want, when I want, and the manner which I want. And sometimes, so often, our prayers revolve around this attitude and this thinking. I want to live in a bubble where there is no harm, no danger can touch me. And when it does not work that way, I get disappointed with God because God doesn't listen to my prayers. We are going to face storms, but never alone. God walks with us in our storms because God in Jesus has been through the storms himself. Like Paul, therefore, we can say in today's reading, if God is for us, who can be against us? God asks for our all, and in return, God gives us everything we need. God becomes for us our strength in our weakness and the light in our darkness. A lot of revelation takes place on the mountains. So does that mean that we run to the nearest hill station? The mountain does not always mean a high place. It is a metaphor, an image for where God's revelation takes place. Psychologists, especially Abraham Maslow, in fact refers to such experiences as peak experiences, meaning those experiences that lead us to something so much of meaning, significance, that we are referred to peak experience. It's a way of saying you're on the mountain. Something exalted, something special. And there are so many such moments in our daily life if we but only recognize them. Let me highlight some that could happen to you. When as a parent or as a grandparent you hold the newborn babe in your arms, it's a transfiguring experience. When you are enthralled by a wonderful experience of a sunrise, a sunset, or a waterfall, your heart is just moved. When you know that you are loved, not for what you do, but for who you are, that can be such an uplifting experience. Let me go on. When two people have fought and then have reconciled, it gives you a joyous high. When a mother-to-be goes through the terrible morning sickness and labor pains, but then finally is faced with the joy of childbirth. When you had the courage to take a stand for justice and speak up for the voiceless, then light breaks through. These are transfiguration experiences, and in a real and a significant way, we experience it through the sacraments. When we go to confession, unload our sins, repenting from our heart, and receive the mercy of God. That must be for us a transfiguring experience. When somebody is sick and needs to be anointed, if they are physically healed and come back, God be praised. If not, we put them in the healing hands of God and are taken into His eternal embrace. That is what I would also call transfiguration. And so there are so many such experiences. Now, this transfiguration appears not only in the happy moments, but even in our disfigured moments. Because God redeems us not only in moments of our transfiguration, but particularly in our moments of disfiguration. Both the consolation and the desolation have their role to play. And God is at the heart of those experiences, which come when we hear the words that the Father utters. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. The transfiguration is not just an event. It's a way of life that we are called to imitate. We are meant to transfigure the earth, our relationships, the church, and as well to be transfigured by others. We are to bring life out of suffering and death, liberation and freedom out of injustice, light out of darkness, hope out of despair and discouragement. There's a beautiful hymn that I like. It's called, "For the God of the mountains is the God of the valley. When things go wrong, He'll make it right. For the God of the good times is also the God of the bad times. The God of the day is the God of the night." Abraham in the first reading listened and obeyed to God who revealed Himself. Peter, James, and John struggled to do so, and they heard the voice of the Father. Listen to my Son. And then, of course, what about you and me? This Eucharist must be for us a transfiguring experience. The Lord has spoken to us. Have we listened so as to obey? We will receive Him in communion to give us strength, that consolation we need, especially when we go through our desolation in life. Because when we do so, we will always be on the mountain.